Thank you very much. I'd like to say good morning, Edinburgh. I just wanted to say that. It's great to be here. I'll just get myself organised here, get all my little odds and ends sorted out. I like odds and ends, it helps me talk. My talk today, I've decided to call 4 questions I'd like to ask myself. So I guess it's like a politician, to be sure that you get the answers you want to talk about, you make sure that the questions are organised as well. But these are actually questions I get asked a lot, so hopefully they'll be questions that you'd like to hear the answers to as well. And the very first one is a question that's actually unique to me. It's not one of those questions that all authors get asked. And that question is Garth Nix your real name? Because it sounds like the perfect made-up name for a writer of fantasy. I mean, you just automatically think, okay, that guy's got to be a writer of fantasy books with a name like that. And actually, it is my real name. It's not a pseudonym, even though it's perfect for it. I mean, one of the other things about it, of course, Nix is in the middle of the alphabet. And when authors gather, as they do, to discuss what pseudonyms they would like to have, this seems to be a very common thing with authors. We all want to have pseudonyms for some reason. There's a sort of an attraction about making up pseudonyms, whether you use them or not. And one of the theories about pseudonyms is you should choose one, your surname that's in the middle of the alphabet, because when the books are put on a bookshelf in a bookstore, they start at A on the top left and they go down to Z on the bottom right. Something in the middle, like N, will be exactly at eye height as you walk in. So, I've got the perfect name for a writer of fantasy. But it's also unusually appropriate because both my names can also be found in the dictionary. I don't think that's very common. Now, Garth, of course, means a walled courtyard or a walled garden, like a cloister garth in a church. It's not all that interesting. Nix, one of the meanings of Nix is nothing. I prefer to ignore that one because I don't really want to be Mr. Nothing. Hi, I'm Garth Nothing. Doesn't sound very good. But much, much more appropriately for me, Nix is also a very old Germanic or Teutonic word for a merman or a water sprite. If you look up Nix in the dictionary, you'll see that's one of the Nix, Nixie, Nissa. They're all words referring to these mermen or water sprites. But my favourite account of what a Nix actually is comes from Encyclopaedia Britannica, which I believe started in Edinburgh, even though it's Encyclopaedia Britannica, many, many years ago. If you look up Nix in Encyclopaedia Britannica, either online or in one of the 10 billion trillion print editions that are still all over the place, it says something along the lines of that a Nix is a creature from Germanic myth, half human, half fish, that's able to assume human form, generally that of an aged crone, a young maiden, or an Australian author. It doesn't say that. I feel it should. In fact, maybe in one of the future revisions of Britannica, they will eventually get up to that. And again, according to myth and legend, Nixes are usually malevolent. They don't like people. They live in the bottoms of lakes and rivers in beautiful underwater palaces. They obviously haven't seen my house. I don't think I'd like to live in an underwater one anyway. Beautiful underwater palaces. And they typically interacted with humans in only 2 ways. They used to either lure them down to the bottom of their lakes to drown them or marry them. One or the other. It was like death or marriage. What's the choice? You're dragged to the bottom of the lake. It's like, will you marry me or drown? It's not much of a question, is it? But I like to think that maybe long ago, one of these mythological Nixes actually married a human, and maybe I'm descended from one of these mythological creatures. So Garth Nix is an absolutely appropriate name for a writer of fantasy. Maybe by being given that name, I was always going to be a writer of fantasy. My parents, by the way, claim that they didn't call me Garth after the comic strip character, which is in the Daily Mail, I think, of the UK, and was in a paper in Melbourne, the Herald Sun. And Garth, the comic strip character, which some of you may know, was very popular in the 50s and 60s, and I was born in 1963. My whole family finds it very amusing that Garth, the comic strip character, is this hugely muscled man with enormously broad shoulders and mighty muscles and a very small head. I, on the other hand, am not particularly muscled, and I have a very large head. My brothers in particular think this is enormously amusing. Now, the next question I'm going to ask myself is, how did you get started writing? Because again, this is something people are always interested to know. When did I start writing? How did I end up, writing lots of books and so on? And I actually got started writing earlier than I remembered. I mean, if you'd asked me this question at one point, I would have said, you know, I started writing stories in my sort of teenage years and so on. But a few years ago at Christmas, the Christmas lunch, my younger brother pulled out a little book, something like this. This is actually a facsimile because the original is in the Smithsonian. No, I actually couldn't find the original. I was looking for it just before I left, and I have a bunch of old stories that I've written and so on, but I couldn't find where I put them. But, you know, when you put something special, very safe, and then you can't find it ever again. So this is a facsimile of a little book that my brother produced at a Christmas lunch with my family and said, you know, I found this when we were cleaning up under my parents' house, and it's a little book called Stories by Garth Nix. And I thought he'd made it just to poke fun at me because it's the sort of thing that brothers do. But my parents said, oh, we remember that. We remember that little book of stories. And this little book of stories, Stories by Garth Nix, only had 3 stories in it. Had probably my very first published story. Admittedly self-published, but you know, you've got to start somewhere. And I'm going to read you the story. It's quite long, so be prepared. A boy went outside, it started raining coins, he picked them up. That's it. Now, when I was given that little book, I was quite encouraged because, okay, it's not a great story. It's not going to be immortalised, that story. But it's got a beginning, a middle and an end. So maybe even when I was 7, I was thinking about the structure of stories. Because a lot of story is structure. It's about how you put a story together. So that was my very, very first self-publication. Then I went on, I wrote stories through my teens, you know, for the school magazine and so on. Not that many. But I had no plans to be a writer. I wasn't particularly thinking of being a writer. In fact, right up until the end of my school years, I thought I was going to join the army and be an army officer. But when I was 17, I joined our equivalent of the Territorial Army and became a part-time soldier. And a few years of being a part-time soldier convinced me I didn't want to be a full-time one, so which was a good lesson. I actually enjoyed that experience, but I also worked out that that wasn't what I wanted to do. So I had to suddenly change my whole plans, you know, for the future. And that all sort of came together when I was actually travelling here in the United Kingdom. I worked for a year to save money. I had an incredibly boring job as a pay clerk for the Australian Public Service, where I coded computer forms for a year. I actually remember all the codes to, you know, change people's pay and so on. It was immensely boring, but there was quite a lot of time for thinking other thoughts, so maybe it was also good training for being a writer. Then I came to the United Kingdom and I bought this beat-up Austin 1600 with a gold-flamed stripe down the bonnet that made it go much faster. I drove all around, all over England, Scotland and Wales, and I reread a lot of my favourite childhood books where they were set. So I reread Alan Garner's The Weirdstone Brisingamen in Cheshire. I read Rosemary Sutcliffe's The Eagle of the Ninth on Hadrian's Wall. I read Robert Louis Stevenson in Scotland. You know, I read Arthur Ransome in the Lake District and so on. I also started to write, and I bought this beat-up, everything was beat up, my car, a beat-up typewriter, a second-hand Silver Reed typewriter. And I wrote the first story that I actually sold on that typewriter. I'm very sad that I don't have it anymore, because I ended up at the end of my trip, I was so broke that I had to sell my typewriter in order to get the bus fare to Heathrow just to get home. I had a ticket, but I couldn't get to Heathrow because I had no money. So that was when I started really thinking I wanted to be a writer. I wrote most of a novel in that time when I was travelling around, a novel called Captain of the Guard. Now, funnily enough, you won't have ever seen this book because I never finished it. And it was I should have learned a lesson that I learned a bit later on. And it's a very important lesson for authors, is that you need to finish things before anything can happen. And it just seems sort of obvious, but it wasn't to me at that time. And in fact, a famous author who I can't remember, which is quite typical of most of people that I quote, I think that's a fantastic quote, and I can't remember who said it. I think an American author said, the only difference between an amateur author and a professional one is that professionals finish things. And I should have learned that.